During the 1950s, protests against the discrimination of colored people became increasingly popular in the United States. Colored people and other minorities who were in support of civil rights came together to protest against the unfair treatment and legislation that was brought upon them. Groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Congress of Racial Equality were impactful towards granting rights for African Americans. One of the most active supporters of civil rights during the 1950s and 60s was Martin Luther King Jr., known as MLK. The biased authority of the U.S. government had enacted laws restricting African Americans from sitting at the front of the bus, as these seats were reserved for whites. In response, King led a bus boycott in Montgomery, protesting the law, which later resulted in the same law being passed as unconstitutional. This boycott, along with a number of others in which he took part, resulted in his incarceration in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. He then published the well-known Letter from Birmingham Jail, in which he emphasized the need for civil rights. King declared, "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights." King was released 8 days later following his arrest. President John F. Kennedy saw the consistent protests against unfair legislation and treatment towards African Americans. On June 11, 1963, he decided it was time to bring notice to the issue.
Martin Luther King was instrumental in guiding President Kennedy toward his awakening on civil rights.
Martin Luther King's fight for the equal rights of all colored people in America impacted President John F. Kennedy's decision to deliver a speech based upon his moral beliefs on civil rights on June 11, 1963, even considering the political risk it created for him to be reelected. This allowed for the issue of racial segregation occurring nationally to be addressed, resulting in positive changes for minorities in America. John F. Kennedy Civil Rights Speech. In September 1962, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, sent U.S. Marshals to influence the federal courts to admit the first African American student into the University of Mississippi. Robert F. Kennedy, as the Attorney General of the United States, worked with President Kennedy to emerge a plan to grant equal rights. On June 11, 1963, Governor George Cornwallis of Alabama had attempted to create a blockade prohibiting 2 African Americans from integrating into the University of Alabama. He stood in front of the Foster Auditorium at the university, refusing to let the students in. After Wallace's attempt of bigotry, John F. Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard. After the federalization, Governor Wallace was confronted by the U.S. Deputy Attorney and was eventually forced into admitting the 2 students into the school. John F. Kennedy was cognizant of the debate on whether the Southern states' votes would be stripped from him if he decided to take a moral stance on civil rights. Despite this likelihood, JFK knew it was time for change.
He grew and evolved while he was in office. And a really important way he grew was in his moral courage. The courage of all types, physical, political, and moral, was crucially important to Kennedy, but it took him time to gain the moral courage to act on civil rights. And he probably wouldn't have gotten there without Martin Luther King as a moral example.
The Wallace conflict was resolved, however. Kennedy, recognizing the recurring racial discrimination happening in the United States, determined it was time to deliver a speech making the problem known. In 1963, JFK televised a speech to call attention to how the civil rights issue in America undoubtedly was something that needed to be changed.
It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color.
He called civil rights a moral issue and emphasizes the necessity of equal rights for all Americans, no matter the color of their skin.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
He covers the segregation seen not only in the instance of education, but also public accommodations and voting rights. He emphasizes his belief that racism was a national problem and was compelled to fix it. By saying this speech, John F. Kennedy's goal was to represent his diplomacy to fix the problem at hand. He asked Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, and to participate in lawsuits designed to end segregation in public education. The speech was controversial, however, due to the South's familiarity with the practice of discrimination towards African Americans. This sparked debate and risked Kennedy's chance of re-election as his stance on segregation stripped Southern states' votes. This risk shows that Kennedy was able to make a moral decision on civil rights in place of a political one. He said, "A man does what he must, in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures, and that is the basis of all human morality." 2 months after Kennedy's speech addressing the injustice, civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a protest at the Lincoln Memorial known best as the March on Washington. There, he led 250,000 people in a protest in support for civil rights for all African Americans in the United States. He delivered his I Have a Dream address.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
He expresses his hope that racial equality will be achieved in the future. All of these events, most importantly JFK's speech, led to the development of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. JFK felt as though this piece of legislation would aid in ending discrimination in America. This act forbid discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, gender, and origin, along with outlawing segregation in public accommodations and federally funded programs. Although JFK proposed the idea, President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's former vice president, signed it into law. This also allowed African Americans, other minorities, and even women to advance and succeed in the workplace without a large amount of racial bias. JFK's speech also allowed for the reinforcement of voting rights for all African Americans, including women, and desegregation of schools at all age levels. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was also passed, outlawing all of the discriminatory voting practices by the Southern states and eventually allowing African American women to vote. African Americans today work to manage and maintain civil rights. Groups such as the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Nonprofit and the African American Civil Rights Network are organizations that help contribute to this movement. The Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Nonprofit continues the advocacy for human rights and social justice for African Americans and minorities. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against any injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. The African American Civil Rights Network facilitates activities to honor the significance of the civil rights movement. This continued fight against segregation allowed the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama, to be elected for a 2-term presidency from 2009 to 2017. This was a historical moment for African Americans within politics. Many books and articles are continuing to be written about equal rights for colored people and history about the civil rights movement as well. Although this movement occurred in the 1960s, it initiated other protests to occur, such as the most recent Black Lives Matter protests. These nationwide protests brought attention to the issue of police brutality, specifically the brutality against African Americans. Although racial equality has predominantly been fixed politically, it is still a continued debate within social problems. The efforts of Martin Luther King and many other civil rights activists allowed for diplomacy to go into effect supporting racial equality in America. These consider the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Act of 1965. These acts granted African Americans more rights, influence in politics, and equality socially. Many risked their freedom in order to fight for what was right. Racial discrimination is still an issue today socially, but politically, the segregation and continued inequality towards African Americans has come to an end. When John F. Kennedy delivered his speech on civil rights, it granted the opportunity for colored people to express themselves and protest against unequal rights. When the president, John F. Kennedy, was able to give this speech, African Americans were thrilled to know that there was finally an effort to grant them their rights that they had long awaited for. Because of Kennedy, the Democratic Party became known for advocating for minorities. This motto continues today within the Democratic Party, continuing the advocacy for the LGBTQ community and the attempt for free healthcare. Today, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day in January to reflect on the nonviolent social change that he was able to achieve. John F. Kennedy, to this day, is honored for his ability to reflect diplomacy despite the debates that occurred, in order to make a moral decision on human rights regardless of the political risk.